Welcome to Studio 21. Guest today, Teresa Miller, the host for the last 15 years of Writing Out Loud, interviews with authors from all over the world. Also the executive director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers. Is there a common thread that you've seen with all these writers that you've talked to?
No, I think that the common thread is there is no thread. That each writer, is as different and unique as we are as individuals, and it's fun to see. It's fun to talk to different ones. I kept thinking that maybe as a writer myself, I would learn some magic formula from talking to all these different writers. But I agree with what Somerset Maugham once said: there are only 3 rules for writing a novel, but no one knows what they are.
Well, you have a situation sometimes when you have some people out there. We talk about, like, recently we had the birthday of Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. Never anything after that. Grace, I think Metalius was her name, who
Peyton
wrote
Place.
in the 1950s. Never really had any success after that. What's the difference between somebody who has that and somebody like James Michener, who keeps kind of cranking them out over the years?
I'm not sure, unless the first novels of Harper Lee. Ralph Ellison's another case in point. In case these first novels are highly autobiographical. I think that happened in my case. I wrote my first novel when I was 25. Yeah. And I had hoped then to have a very prolific career, but suddenly after that first novel, I just sort of dried up. But then on the other hand, when you look at Harper Lee, she got all this recognition, a Pulitzer Prize, the movie version got an Oscar and is regarded as one of the all-time great films. She had already, trumped anything she could ever do. Years ago, this is kind of a funny story, when I was living in Tahlequah and trying to, make contact with writers, I decided to try to call Harper Lee. This was in the day when there were actually phone operators. So I called down to the Monroeville, Alabama operator. And I said, could you give me the number for Harper Lee? And she said, honey, Harper's number's unlisted, but she lives with her sister Alice, and I'll give you Alice's number. So I called Alice and then got Harper Lee on the phone and actually got a chance to talk to her for a few minutes. And what a thrill. What a thrill. But a great lady. And, she didn't seem bothered by the fact that she hadn't written another book. Some writers get tormented. I think Ralph Ellison was tormented for the rest of his career that he couldn't do something more substantial after The Invisible Man. But Harper Lee seems very content in her life.
Is all writing therapy?
In some ways, I think it is. I just finished a memoir not long ago, Means of Transit, and it had been a long time in coming. And I have to say that after I wrote it, it was almost like I had found margins for my life, that I'd been able to sort of put things in perspective and then turn the page literally and figuratively.
Now, you talk about those basic rules in order to write. Do you have some basic rules?
Well, yes and no. I tell my students that they need to discipline themselves, they need to write every day, and I try to do that, but I don't do it myself. I think the rule is if you can be true to your own voice. The main problem I get into is when I start thinking too much in terms of my audience. Funny story, when I wrote my first book, my editors double-checked everything. These were New York editors, and one of them said, you need to have more detail in this book, and this is Remnants of Glory. And I said, okay, I'll go back. And I had 2 sisters, and I thought, they're working. In the kitchen, I'll have them clean fish. Seems innocent enough. And then I thought, I'm really good at this detail stuff. I'll have them do catfish. And then I went too far because I know nothing about fish, and I mentioned scales. Well, the book came out. This slipped through all 5 copy editors, and the book comes out, and suddenly I start getting postcards in the mail. Catfish do not have scales. Well, I was just devastated, devastated. So then I became paranoid. I wouldn't eat fish. Still don't eat fish because of that. But, I'm kidding. But I decided that I cannot be so afraid of making a mistake that I don't take the venture, that I don't take the opportunities to move forward and try different things.
Now, you have 3 published works that are pretty significant and have gotten some very good reviews. You went 18 years between one to the other.
Yes.
What was happening during those 18 years?
I think I was resisting the story I wanted to tell, which was a family story and some things in my life. And I had, for so many years, said I'm not going to do anything autobiographical. even in fiction. And I just denied, like everything, that my first novel was at all autobiographical. I now know, looking back on it, that it was various removes from my own life. The same circumstances didn't help happen in my life, but still they were there. So I decided I'm going to do something totally apart from my life, and that's what led me astray. Once I got comfortable in my own voice and comfortable with my own life experience, it was much easier.
Were you beaten up on yourself during those 18 years, saying, why aren't I doing this?
Absolutely. That's what launched my career as an administrator of a literary center of poets and writers. Was so hungry for the company of other writers and hoping I might find some magic answer. So I started a TV show and started pulling them in. I started a book conference and everything that I could think of to try to get some answer that would help me in my own life. And then the scariest thing I learned was that the answers were all within me. It was up to me.
Well, I had a chance a number of years ago to interview Neil Simon, and he said all his work was like therapy. And you go back and you see the family, you see the brothers. He also talked about the home he grew up in, which I was surprised with. It wasn't very literate. He said there were 2 books in the place, and they were really decorations. What kind of environment did you grow up in, and did that indicate maybe you'd be a writer someday?
Well, there were no writers in my family. I came from a family of attorneys, but you know, I've learned that there's a sort of a wonderful poetry to the law. Some of the phrasing and legal writing I thought has always had a poetic edge to it. And certainly I was very fortunate in that my family was all well-read. My father had been a groupie for years, and he'd actually met Robert Frost once. He asked the question, you know, there's that repeated line in Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening, and miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. So he raised his hand and he said, "Mr. Frost, what did you mean by that?" And Mr. Frost said, "Not a damn thing." so all of our speculation as teachers is...
Well, but couldn't that be that those words were so deep in his soul? You know, there's a quote that I wrote down recently. He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who conquers a city.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that he may not have known, you know, just exactly all the different resonances that were in his life. Frost might not have when he wrote those lines. And I think he was just sort of speaking to the fact that, literature is not a puzzle to solve in any way. But I do think, I agree with what Emily Dickinson once said, that ourselves behind ourselves concealed would startle most. That it would be better to meet a burglar in your back alley than to confront yourself unarmed. And so I think what I had to do as a writer was be willing to confront myself unarmed, and that was tricky.
Was it painful? Were there times when you just sat there in front of a keyboard and...
Yes, particularly when I got to the memoir, because then there's no pretext to fiction. I mean, you're with a hardcore core truths, and I think particularly writing about my mother's death and some of the ramifications of that, it was tricky. But I think at the end of the day, I'm glad I did it, and I feel that it helped me, as I say, really come to terms with it in a new way.
Well, for the viewers who aren't familiar, you lost your mother at age 2 when you were 2. So that was a difficult period. As you're processing this, we're talking about your last published book, which is Family Correspondence.
No, it's Means of Transit.
Apologize. Tell me about that process. How long did it take? Did you outline, or did you just sit in front of that keyboard?
You know, how long does it take? A whole lifetime,
yeah.
You know, when you're writing a memoir. That's the tricky thing. I think the actual writing of it went pretty quickly, and it went about 6 months. And a book that was a great inspiration to me was Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginnings. And she didn't try to tell everything about her life in that book, but she tried to identify 3 sequences in her life. And so once I was able to, you know, fixate on 3 sequences in my life, all related to a journey theme, it made it so much easier. It seemed to me that in our lives we were always getting in the car and going somewhere, trying to cross boundaries emotionally and literally. And it seemed to me that once I came upon that it was easier for me to move forward and tell my story.
How important in the process of getting a book published is an editor? What role did the editor play for you in this last work and the others?
I think that the editor who had the most influence on me, and she's still influencing my career today, is the editor of my first novel, because I really sold that book without having a great sense of what was expected of me as a writer. I mean, I was living in Tahlequah and had sent a manuscript off, you know, just blindly to an agent in New York, and no one was more stunned than when she called and she said, "I think I can sell this for you." And within 3 weeks, she had sold it to Playboy Enterprises. I didn't know that at the time. There was always this wonderful little imprint name that we used, Seaview Books, and I thought it was very poetic. Seaview, view from the sea. Turned out, you know, that when I got my first check, there was a little bunny in the upper left-hand corner, which really, you know, was quite a little stir in Tahlequah that I would do that. But Sherry, my editor Sherry, who has since gone on and launched audiobooks at Random House, was a pioneer in that field, was just wonderful with me. I mean, she helped me dig deeper to bring out the rich detail. One of my weaknesses as a writer, when you grow up in a place and spend your whole life there, like I did in Tahlequah, I didn't see what had become all too obvious to me. It was hard for me to share my vision of Tahlequah with other people, and Sherry helped me, you know, look at Tahlequah with fresh eyes. And that was a wonderful experience, and for me to look and to be more visual about this place. And
how did that play out? Was it phone calls? Did they you exchange the little notes on your script? Or?
A lot of notes. I mean, I had no idea what I was in for. You know, I thought I had some hard professors in college and who'd been pretty critical. Well, when money's at stake, when book sales are at stake, I mean, the criticism is uncompromising. So I literally have, Loren, 3 typing reams full of notes that Sherry wrote me. I would send in, you know, chapters of the book, and then she would write on a legal pad, she would just write out notes. On page 3, you need more action. This scene is too choppy. You know, this is way too melodramatic. Sounds like a soap opera. And then the scene that I thought was the worst, she said, this scene is brilliant. And I thought, well, I thought this is the worst one. So, you know, I had clearly no judgment. And she was able to help me see the book from her eyes, from an outsider's point of view, and so on, and it was really very helpful.
Did you have tough fights over, you know, disagreements over where you should go?
I was pretty good to capitulate on that first book because I got to thinking, and I know that there are all these wonderful stories about writers holding their ground. I was never pushed to that point that I had to do something that was uncomfortable for me, but I realized that I was working with 2 literary agents and a top-notch editor, and that they hadn't gotten to that level in their careers without being pretty darn good at what they do. So I thought for me, one of the best things I could do would be to listen. My older agent gave me some good advice, and she said, you know, Teresa, you're going to be getting lots of suggestions from all 3 of us, and a lot of times they won't even fit. I mean, I will think one thing, your editor will think something else. And the key is to listen to us all very carefully, but then rely on your own instincts. And so I finally learned to rely on my own instincts. A funny little regional thing that came up. My editor was born and raised in New York, and I had used the expression blinky milk. Have you heard of blinky milk?
No.
And my editor took that word so literally, and she looked it up in the dictionary on the blink. She said, I really don't know what you mean about this. And in our parlance, in southern culture, blinky milk is milk that's just about to go sour, but that it hasn't gotten there yet. So I was going back and I was talking with my agent about some of the changes that needed to be made and that were being suggested, and I had said, in this one, blinky milk. Well, my agent was from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and she said, I know what blinky milk is. We're leaving that in. So we did. So there were a few little things, but nothing major. For the most part, I felt that all of my advice that I got was excellent, was superb, really.
Kind of a trick question here. Can you teach writing?
Yes and no. You can teach the discipline of writing, but you can't teach the creativity of writing. The discipline of writing is the fact that you've got to reach a point that you can allow yourself to make mistakes, that you're not so scared of, you know, sticking to certain boundaries or fitting a certain genre, that you're not willing to be creative, that you're just churning out. You've got to get beyond the idea that you're just churning out the same thing that's already been churned out. You have to go into new territory, if you will, and sort of share a larger vision. And so I think you can get people comfortable with that. You can teach the discipline. You can talk about some of the techniques. But the creative ideas have to come from within you. That's what makes it so scary.
What about influences? Books that you read early that said, maybe I could become a writer, and almost copying a style. Have you ever done that?
Well, I've certainly been influenced, particularly by the great Southern women writers that were all of the same generation: Catherine Ann Porter, Eudora Welty, Harper Lee, Flannery O'Connor. Particularly, I was a fan of Carson McCullough's, and I loved what they did with words, that they not only told a good story, but they told a beautifully written story, and that was very impressive to me. And in recent years, there are other books that I've admired a great deal. I just discovered later in life Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is a beautiful book, just one of the most beautiful books I think ever written.
There's a story about Truman Capote and a young writer coming to Truman Capote and asking Mr. Capote to look at his work. And Truman looked at this for a while. He looked up at the writer and said, this isn't writing, this is typing. How many times have there been times when people have come to you and asked for advice, and how do you frame this so you don't destroy somebody?
Well, you know, that's a really good question, and it's a responsibility I take very seriously, and anybody who reads someone else's work needs to take that responsibility seriously, because you don't want to crush someone's spirit. And there are any number of stories of people out there who got, you know, crushing criticisms of books that went on to become bestsellers. I mean, Jaws was rejected something like 29 times before it was eventually published. And, you know, if Peter Benchley had given up with the first, you know, negative criticism, you've got to be careful, you've got to catch your words. And also, as a reviewer, I have to remind myself when I'm reviewing someone else's work that I may be wrong. I mean, that it's all very subjective, and what a book that might not seem that appealing to me might be to someone else.
One thing I'm noticing as I get older is there a generational appeal in literature?
Oh, sure. I mean, sure. We see, you know, YA is a wide open field right now. Huge sales. I mean, when you look at J.K. Rowling's, and then earlier Susie Hinton's work, you know, in the YA, all these breakout books in YA. P.C. Cast, a recent addition to the field, who's just, you know, selling books like gangbusters with her work. Just the House of Night series and all of that. So I do think there's a generational appeal.
Well, we've got the internet, we've got a digital era. How different is it in terms of getting something published a number of years ago to now?
I think really there's some advantages. At first I was a little worried about the moving in of technology, but practically speaking, with my first book, I typed it out on a typewriter. I had carbon paper. I didn't have a Xerox machine to use. I'd have to use that liquid paper to correct mistakes. It was a messy, messy business. And if I had to correct something in the book, literally many times I would love to have made a correction or change in the manuscript, like a character name, but it was just too time consuming. We couldn't go back and retype the whole book. So you couldn't make a lot of the changes that today are so easy with computer technology. I also think that digital publishing, though some people are afraid of it, I think it's a godsend, because I think digital publishing is going to allow a lot of people to publish who might not get the chance otherwise, because paper prices, printing prices have gotten so expensive. And digital publishing has just opened up all sorts of doors. I am a huge book lover. I use books to decorate my house. I love having them around. But I've got a Kindle, and I've got to say, I just think it's the most wonderful device in the world. I can get a book with a punch of the button and change the font sizes, and I think it's terrific.
Well, that helps me, really, to be able to change the font style.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
We're going to play a little game here. And
Okay.
I mean, 15 years of interviewing authors.
Yeah, it's a long time.
You know, I want to give some names, and I'd like just some reaction to it. Jack Eisner.
Oh, one of my favorite interviews of all time, because that changed my life. It changed the way I viewed everything. I didn't know quite what to expect. I'd never met a Holocaust survivor before, and he had had a very, very tragic life. He had been taken to Auschwitz right after he had gotten a music scholarship. His whole family was incarcerated. He didn't know what had happened to his relatives. Then when he was released and free, he didn't know where to connect with people. I mean, no phones. I mean, you know, cell phones, none of the ways we have to get in touch with each other today. And he was at a train station, and he told this story on camera. He was at a train station, and then suddenly he heard a voice and someone calling out a nickname he'd been called as a little boy, a family nickname. And it was his mother's voice, and it was such a swarm of people that a group of men lifted her up on their shoulders so he could see her, and they were reunited there. And as he told that story, and it turned out the rest of their family had been killed, but as he told that story, my camera guys, who are pretty thick-skinned, they had tears running down their cheeks. And I guess what impressed me so much in talking with Jack, and he died shortly after our interview, is how graceful and kind he was. And I thought, to have lived through all of that and the pain, and to be able to be so gracious, what a lesson for all of us.
I had a close friend die recently of breast cancer, and you interviewed actress and author who had that same fate.
Lynn Redgrave, yes. Lynn Redgrave, again, one of the standout moments for me. I actually got to spend some time with her and her daughter Annabelle when they were in Tulsa. We had brought them in through Poets and Writers to do Lynn's one-woman show. And then Annabelle had taken all these wonderful photos of her mother as she was going through the diagnosis of breast cancer, the surgery, and then the recovery for what then was hoped to be a recovery. So we had the exhibit, and the two of them were together, so we would find ourselves in the car and just driving around Tulsa and doing various things. So we talked a lot. And they were wonderful women to spend time with, and had such a healthy view of their relationship and of life. And I learned from them that you can be infirm in body, but so healthy in spirit that it makes a huge difference. And it was wonderful getting to spend time with them. And I found that Lynn was very forthcoming in the interview that we did. She was very open about sharing her experience with other people, because she seemed to feel a responsibility to make it easier for others if she could. And I just thought, the other thing that struck me about her, and you've interviewed a lot of people, and you know, sometimes people come on and they are sort of made up, and you can tell that they have on their television persona. She didn't wear a persona of any kind. She could totally be herself. I thought, and it's great contrast. Here's a woman who can go on stage and be these great characters, and certainly she was a wonderful actress, but she can also be herself too, without the makeup, without the wigs, and just be who she was. And I was impressed by how comfortable she was in her own skin.
Jim Lehrer is somebody that we're mostly all familiar with from watching the evening news. Is there a difference between the guy you see on TV, on public TV, and the author?
If anything, he's even nicer in person than he is on TV. He is one of the finest people I've ever met, the consummate professional. I first met him when I was teaching over at Claremore, and I just wrote him a letter cold and said, I'm launching this book festival and we don't have any money, will you come? And he wrote back and said, sure, I'll come if I don't have to stay at the Elm Motel. And there is an Elm Motel there. And I thought, how does he know about that? Well, as it turned out, his dad was a bus driver, and so he'd traveled all over, got free bus trips, and so he'd traveled all over this part of the country. He's from Kansas originally. And over the years, I've got to know him in so many levels, professionally and personally, and he is just a stand-up person. He is totally self-sacrificing in terms of what he does. I think his decision to step down as sole anchor of the NewsHour, because he thought that they needed a more, a layered format, just shows that, it's no ego involvement for him. He was tough to interview in this sense, not because of anything he did, but I suddenly was overwhelmed during the course of interviewing him and thinking, oh my God, he's interviewed presidents and all of this. And then during the interview, he said something about one of the things he had learned as an interviewer was that, yes, you want your list of questions, but you don't want your questions to be so driving the interview that if something comes up unexpectedly, you can't go with it. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I've been doing. I haven't been picking up things. So even during the course of that interview, I think I'm revising my interviewing technique just a little bit, listening to him. But he's a pro, very down to earth, and very humble.
Ken Burns really probably made a bigger splash than almost anyone in the past decade, with the Civil War series, with baseball, with jazz. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Oh, he's terrific. I was nervous about interviewing because he is so accomplished and, expert in so many areas. I mean, not only in filmmaking, but the historical research he has to do his films. And so, first time I interviewed him, I was a little nervous, but he immediately put me at ease. And he's an interviewer's dream because he's so articulate, and he is so concise in his answers and so right on. Funny story, right after the interview, I was interviewing him in Stillwater. He was making an appearance there, and they had asked me, the organizers of this event, if after the interview was over, I would drive Ken back to this bed and breakfast. Well, I'm directionally challenged. We get in the car, and I said, I don't want to admit that I don't know where I'm taking him, and he said, I believe you need to turn here, and you need to turn here. Then he explained to me that whenever he goes to a town, whether it's for a shoot or for a public appearance, that he always learns the layout of the town immediately. That's just second nature to him. So he knew where everything in Stillwater was the minute he landed.
Oh my goodness.
So it was a lot of fun.
Some of my favorite books, autobiography of Charlie Chaplin, autobiography of Will Rogers and Mark Twain. if you look at some of the life experiences of these individuals, a lot of their humor came from intense pain.
Yes.
Now, you interviewed Dave Barry. Where does his humor come from, darn it?
I don't know. You know, I told him, I said when I was talking to him, I said, you know, what if you have a bad day, you know, and your day and your toilet explodes and you don't feel like writing? He said, if my toilet explodes, it's a good day because it gives me something funny to write about. But he also was very frank in the interview that he was just crushed after 9/11. He just felt that he could not write his column anymore and be funny anymore after such a devastating event in our country. And then he gradually came to understand that people need to laugh, that laughter is healing. And you know, I understood his points, but you know, he was very, very easy and fun to interview. He's just naturally funny. He just naturally has a funny take on life.
Teresa Miller, thank you so much for visiting. We're going to be putting up some information at the end of this about Teresa Miller's website, where you can see lots of neat reference material and videos and snippets with authors, and also coming events as well. You've got some great stuff coming up.
Thank you, Loren.
Thank you, Teresa. It's been a lot of fun.
I've loved it.
And thank you for joining us for Studio 21.